Welcome again to another episode of the National Conservative Institute of Australia podcast. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Gary Johns. Gary Johns is known to many in Australia because not only was he a minister in the Keating government and a member of Parliament in the Hawke government, but since leaving Parliament, he's gone on to write a number of books, be a columnist for The Australian, and generally make a contribution across the board whenever there's interesting matters of public debate. But the reason I thought it'd be particularly interesting to get Gary on today is that, as anyone has been watching knows and been following the NatCom movement globally, there's been a reassessment in many quarters about the policy framework and changes that went on during the 80s and 90s. And because Gary had a front row seat of that, I just thought it'd be interesting to hear his perspective on that. So my first sort of rather basic question, Gary, is there anything sort of first of all worth adding to your bio? What else should one emphasise when you're introducing Gary Johns?
Thank you. Right now, I chair a group called Close the Gap Research, which seeks to focus on Aboriginal people in need, those who need the gap to be closed, and away from the nonsense of reconciliation, which has nothing to do with people's lives. It's just a political power play. And prior to that, I was Commissioner for the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission and spent many years in various think tanks. And I think I'm up to 10 books now, having written. Other than that, I'm yours.
All right, no worries. Well, my first very rather basic question, but which I've never heard you asked, is why did you join the ALP?
Oh, delightful question. I came from working class origins, Kensington in Melbourne, but politics was never discussed around the table, but it was just an assumption that you were Labor. I suspect we're Anglican, but I suspect my mother may have voted DLP, I don't know. There was simply, I didn't know anyone else other than our small group of working class people. I wouldn't have known a Liberal, for instance. I wouldn't have known a lawyer or an accountant. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a university until I got to sort of level 12 and they said I should, go and look at that option. So the Labor thing was by assumption. I mean, just by association, really. And then I became active because there were all sorts of things that worried me in the world at that time. I went off to study economics and politics at Monash. I could have done it at Melbourne University, and I lived only a kilometre or two away from Melbourne, but it demanded that if I studied economics and politics, I had to study accounting as well. So that was the end for me. I went off to Monash, very radical campus, and it started my great interest in politics there.
Right. And so, and I'm sure we could go into all sorts of, people that you knew then and what they became and the debates on campus and the like. But what did you believe then that you don't believe now? How has your thinking sort of changed? And I guess I'm getting more, not so much the university days, because, God knows people believe all sorts of crazy things then, but more once becoming a member of Parliament, and as a minister at that particular time, how has your worldview kind of changed since then?
But it changed before I got into Parliament. Okay, so what was happening is that there were those elements in the 70s that were very anti-American, against the Vietnam War, not at all happy with simple market capitalism, etc., etc. Labor was about dividing pie rather than creating it. Okay. But by 1980, that's 7 years before I went to Parliament, and perhaps because of my economics background, I'd started to think much more about the creation of wealth rather than its distribution. Now, I wasn't alone in that. That was really the thinking of a new class of Labor person who started to enter the Parliament in the early 1980s, Hawke coming through in 83. So that's the moment. Now, how that arrived, well, I'm not quite sure. I've said to many people, it was a moment in time when a group of very competent people came together and thought that they should be engaging with the whole of Australian society and its economy, and not simply some sort of subclass and talk only about redistribution. So we're pretty open-minded, reasonably economically rational, and there it is. We came together at a point in time.
And when you were studying economics, I mean, Australia, elected an ALP government in '83 under Hawke. At the same time, there was Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to our closest allies, and we couldn't help but influenced by that. And there was, while we would, they wouldn't necessarily admit it, there was a new emerging bipartisan consensus being established in those major Anglosphere countries, right? I guess what's a bit interesting to me is that it wasn't just a change in policy. It wasn't just more concrete sort of thinking. It's always celebrated these days as sort of with a certain mythology, right? Everything before that time was a sort of benighted age. It was the Australia settlement where people, they might have been like Menzies or some of the Labor luminaries, avuncular civic professors who said interesting things and kind of had challenges that they dealt with. But essentially, they didn't really understand economics. And we new guys who have arrived here in the 80s with our economics degrees and all the rest of it, we now understand how the world really works. And things like tariffs, the like, what are they really good for? Clearly, they're economically illiterate, and we just have to dismantle them in the most sensible and kind of least disruptive way possible. But ultimately, there's no assessment about whether they make sense or not. Is that unfair? Is that of the sort of description?
Yeah, that's
of the
unfair.
part?
I think there was deep thinking about the impact of tariffs and how that we were an insular economy and used tariffs to protect the manufacturing sector, but it wasn't true in the farming sector. We were free traders essentially. Look, there are a number of people who got to Gough Whitlam. He started to bring down the tariff barrier, so that's a long time before Hawke arrived.
That's
so
right.
These things are a long conversation. So enough people are convinced that we had to reach out and be more open in our trading, that the deals between, Transport Workers Union or Manufacturing Workers Unions and the bosses, the manufacturers, were not a sensible way to sustain a manufacturing base to our economy. So you see that Labor had to do some more thinking, but so did the Liberal Party, because they received a lot of money from those old protected manufacturers. Although increasingly in time they received money from mining companies who didn't care about tariffs. It didn't affect their business. So partly there are events going on in the background about the Australian economy. Partly it's an intellectual exercise where some new thinking, if you like, gets to a broader number of people. And there were very good people in the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, at that time. Hawke being the obvious one, but Bill Kelty as well, and many others, who, for whatever reason, had begun to think more broadly and more, as we would say then, economically rationally. And look, these things come in fits and starts. For instance, much of our discussion was about the Commonwealth ownership of, say, banks, airlines, telecommunications, right? Now, that's partly driven by a revision of how Australia grew, that many of those things were owned by government because we simply weren't big enough to create our own. And then you get to a point to say, well, why does government run this anymore? I remember we had this discussion with John Button, the industry minister, and he would walk in and say, why do we own a Telstra? Why do we run an airline? And we, our little group at least, the centre left, didn't need any convincing. To ask the question was enough. But some of the hard politics behind that, of course, is that treasurers are always looking for money. So selling assets wasn't such a nasty idea, but to receive money in return for a treasurer to play with, wow, that was exciting for the treasurer. Can I just throw in one advertisement here? As a parliamentary secretary, so a very junior person on the front bench, I was given the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory to look after, and I went down to Travancore in Melbourne and saw the CEO, who was Peter McNamara, I think it was, McNamee or McNamara, you know, the tennis players. He was one of the, but he was quite a brilliant surgeon, but he was running CSL. And we had a discussion, and foolishly I said, "What do you need?" And he said, "I need capital." I said, "Well, perhaps we'll have to apply to the Department of Finance." He said, "Don't worry about it. By the time it came through, the opportunity would be gone." So I said, "So you want to be sold?" It was as simple as that. That moment, so that was about 1991, was that the conversations could be had. Then, of course, the unions blew up and all the rest of it, but they were paid out by given, I think they were given 1,000 shares each, and those shares are worth a lot of money, and that's one of our most successful companies. But there it is. There were so many people in that government who were quite willing to get into the business of, let's get into the marketplace, let's let these companies go.
Why did they think Australia had tariffs from 1900 until, like you said, Gough Whitlam, when he introduced the first big 30% cut to tariffs? Why did they think they existed? Was it just an intellectual error that somehow had been persisted to for too long,
No, I think it was an historic, there are historic reasons, i.e., we were sitting out at the bottom of the world, out of place, almost out of time, certainly out of region. You know, this sort of white society sitting down there, very sensitive towards race and so on, and also trying to build economies where we were okay on the agricultural side, and you know, England wanted our food, for instance, but very weak on the manufacturing side. So of course you were looking for devices that might assist. And the only big player in Australia at that time was, in a sense, the Commonwealth government. All the rest was British money, and the British money probably came from manufacturers. So, you know, given the history of these things, yes, you can build a society behind a tariff wall, but after a while you say, do we need this anymore? And that really was thinking that probably came through from the 60s and into the 70s, eventually became public policy. Now you want to talk about a revisit of that, and we should have that discussion on the basis of what's happening in 2024.
That's right. I mean, I think, well, and you were there and discussing it all, but I do sort of think that there is a painting of the guys prior to the, you know, poor Keating era at the very least, as not really understanding trade. But when you actually look at what they were doing with imperial preference and negotiations, and Menzies, for example, you know, he was well aware of the debates in the UK with the Liberal Party and Joseph Chamberlain and those type of things. He couldn't not help to have been, because they were live discussions in Australia. You know, we had a free trade party. We had a free trade sort of advocates here in the lead up to federation. And there are also those who are thinking, look, no, as a nation, we need to have our own industrial base. Menzies didn't believe, you know, Menzies imposed tariffs on manufactured goods coming from Britain to Australia, because he thought that we needed to have our own as a new nation, regardless of whether in a perfect, ideal economic sense is the most efficient answer. We needed to have some type of industrial base ourselves for reasons of economic sovereignty and the like. And what I see now is a little bit, well, you know, there has been a change in the United States. There are Trump introduced tariffs. Biden has kept those tariffs. Trump's stated policy is that we're going to increase those tariffs on particularly Chinese goods, but across the board, basically establish a new tariff wall as the means of rejuvenating, you know, manufacturing in the United States. And my question is like, well, why is that not sensible for us to do that here too? I mean, why? There's a massive resistance to it because so many people, it was sort of like the ticket to Club Sensible in Australia to
Sure.
or political discussion,
Yep.
that you had to
Yep.
buy into the Howard Hawke Keating consensus. And now I think people haven't. I just think there needs to be a reassessment, and people are struggling to work out. Well, they're either
Well,
rejected
okay.
in total, or yeah, that's okay.
The
See where I'm heading.
circumstances now, that economics is not king, security is. And that became most apparent during COVID. So we worried that we could bring into Australia all of those things that we needed. And all of our oil came in as crude oil from Singapore. Now it comes in as refined oil from Singapore. So we begin to worry that if something happens, China interferes with our trading routes and so on, that we simply won't be able to operate. So the discussion begins at a political level to say, I think we better do more things in Australia, whether it's medical supplies or industrial supplies. Then how best should we do that? Then you might look at instruments, for instance, like tariffs. But even this government, the current Albanese government, won't talk about that, but it's quite happy to pour billions of dollars into the pockets of particular manufacturers on another political basis, which is the whole nonsense of the climate change response. So politicians are always manoeuvring around to try to win votes. At the moment, there's a sensitivity in the electorate about making sure that we can make things here and we're not simply at the end of a production line. And everyone understands that. How a government responds, I think, is the most important thing. And I think they should do it in the slowest and most efficient way. I spend the least amount of money trying to settle down an electorate on those sensitivities. That sounds crude, but it's not. At the same time, perhaps working through what the minimum is for an Australian economy. That's a very difficult discussion to have. It's very difficult thinking, because you're then saying, well, the government probably should be running everything here. If you're going to have that discussion, then the government says, well, I think we need a mega plan. We need a 5-year plan. We need a 10-year plan. Once we talk about that, I get very nervous about it. I think that's deadly stuff. And tariffs are simply an element of that broader discussion. What's happening in the US now is that the US is sore over the rise of China. It doesn't like the way China cheats and is able to manipulate its own economy in the way that the US can't. So naturally, the US is saying, well, can we do some manipulation too? Can we pay you back? Can we have a fight? But the US is limited by the fact that there are voters in the US who, in some states, are rusted out and would like to reform their manufacturing base. And in the rest of the states, they're all consumers who say, I don't care. I just want the cheapest car or white goods or whatever. That's the balance that can't be, forgotten about.
There's been a realization in Australia that security is an element of what we need to consider with respect to China when formulating industrial policy. And the response has been, and I don't think I'm unfair when I say this, that they have decided we're not going to change our trade arrangements. In fact, we're going to continue on zero tariff manufactured goods coming in from China. So that will continue. Tony Abbott's expressed misgivings about the very trade agreement he signed, which allows that. But it exists, and I haven't heard really anyone conduct a sort of detailed and sophisticated examination about how precisely you would change that agreement. And so instead, bipartisan zero tariffs, no one wants to change it. As you mentioned, Jim Chalmers doesn't. But instead, we're throwing money at what we think are the critical, strategic, a lot of money into defense, lot of money into so-called critical minerals, and then a few other things with the government, like solar panels and God knows quantum computing that the government thinks are shiny and new. And I don't think like industrial policy or manufacturing has ever been done in that particular way. It's there's always been a need for a tariff. The ones that have been successful, you've always had some barriers to other people coming into your market, and then internally in your market, you should be able to run it as free as possible, right? So, we've sort of got the worst of all possible worlds at the moment. And the other reason, while people have grasped the security element for why some elements of trade investment need to be reassessed, trade, it's not just an element of economics, it's security, and it's an element of foreign policy, but it's also has a social impact, right? JD Vance, vice president nominee in the United States, wrote his book describing the former industrial Midwest, the sort of arsenal of democracy, which helped win wars and was sung about in Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen songs. And if you instead say that goods can just be t-shirts can be imported from China to Long Beach, California, rather than being produced internally, you do make that Midwest area less relevant. You're simply and there are massive social consequences. And so in Australia, hooray, we no longer have an automotive industry, right? We pat ourselves on the back and because it was inefficient, and yet all those people, we now have spend our entire budget on social security. We have these booming industries which essentially are government funded, NDIS, or all the sort of different assorted green schemes. And my question is, stepping back, well, is that really progress? Wouldn't you have been better off maintaining at least some type of manufactured industry, so the trade, the guys who want to tinker with their hands and build things can actually have real world, responsibilities and learn things, rather than suddenly they don't longer exist in Adelaide. You don't have that opportunity to go and to use their skills. So there is a social element, which I think has been a little bit forgotten in that. But what say you? I mean, is that not a reason for a proper reassessment of what we've done over the last 30
well, the simple
years?
answer is no, never. And the longer answer is if it weren't manufacturing, it would be something else. It's better to take the products where they're made from most cheaply. So, for instance, you talk to car sales people in this country, they say it's a very hard market because Australians want cars from everywhere, and you can only sell small, tens of thousands of each different car. We're never going back to a Holden and a Ford. We're just not doing that. So it's not possible to manufacture cars in Australia when Australians want a whole variety of cars from, Saabs to Hondas or whatever. Then you have to say, well, what else would they manufacture? So you end up chasing what you think might be something that Australian consumers want and then plugging the workers in. By the time you get to that, you're going to be very sad and very broke. So the main thing is to allow people to move on from the places where they used to work. And that can happen in big chunks, like you closed down a factory in Elizabeth in Northern Adelaide or Geelong, and it does have massive consequences, I realise. But at the moment we are running at over full employment, partly because we're paying for it, because we've got new people coming into NDIS, aged care, and preschool, long day care and so on. So I agree government is picking up too much, but that's a different issue. And we're in great debt. We actually can't afford all those jobs. So if you took the money out, you had less of that work, you would have more people looking for work. But I have no doubt that they would be trained in other things that we could actually make money from. So, yeah, I just don't like the idea that a transition is a good thing. Like we're right in the middle of a transition now to a sort of a post-coal, oil and gas society, except we're not. That's just a joke. We're going to destroy coal and the little manufacturing that we have based on cheap energy for this crazy notion that we can change the Earth's temperature. And people are saying, well, we have to make sure that we pay the workers to transition to whatever. The Libs say to nuclear technology, the Greens say to, well, I don't know what the Greens say, but, to tourism. That's, I think, always the last scoundrel, isn't it? I'd rather the pollies did one thing: just stick to cheap energy. Stop playing everyone else's game. And if we have cheap energy, we'll do a heck of a lot. And of course, that's what the US has done. It's what's Trumpy saying? Drill, drill, drill. So they got plenty of gas and plenty of oil, and no matter what they sign up to in terms of net zero, they will make themselves more likely to be successful at manufacturing or whatever based on cheap energy.
Yeah, but they had, we're the coalition or whatever pushing nuclear as a way of getting cheap energy in Australia and re-establishing a manufacturing industry here. But the United States has had nuclear power and cheap energy for a long time, and yet, and still, it has had its industrial base hollowed out from China. I remember an Australia Day function in Hong Kong, must have been 2007, 2008, thereabouts. Peter Costello, good speaker, regaled the lunchtime room full of booze. And he said, look, it's just, I go to the States and it's good to be Australian. We understand economics. So I chat to these congressmen and they're saying, we're worried that China will produce all our cars. And he says, I don't, words to the effect, I'll probably slightly misquoting, but words to the effect is, it shouldn't matter whether China produces all of America's cars or not. Everyone will specialize in their own thing. I mean, do you... It shouldn't matter whether Australia doesn't produce shirts.
But all I'm saying is I wouldn't come at it from that end. I'm just saying Australia's internal market is 26 million. It's tiny compared to the ability to manufacture at mass. The US internal market is several hundred million, 260 or whatever. It's a big internal market. Yeah, so it's possible for them to manufacture a great deal and sell it competitively, if you like, against a Chinese, a South Korean, a Japanese.
Because at the moment, without tariffs and sort of the legacy of the Hawke, we don't, our percentage of people who do manufacturing in Australia is lower, I think, than that federation, right? So we are a deindustrialized economy. We have probably more deindustrialized than the Europe and the United States. We have benefited, unlike those guys, because we've been fortunate to have these, mineral riches that we've been able to sell to China. But we don't manufacture anything of substance here, really. And the big industries, real estate and resources, are stuff that can't be outsourced. Right, and then there's 10 on top of software and a few other things in finance and stuff supporting the housing market.
I'm not seeing the problem. I'm seeing full employment and high incomes. That's what Australia has, and it's not based on manufacturing and hasn't been for a very long time. And manufacturing in all developed countries is a declining element in terms of employment and probably in terms of income generated. It's a declining element. We can simply make things more cheaply. There'll come a time, of course, when the Chinese don't make everything. It'll go to other countries unless the communists deem that it will be made in China. So we shouldn't sort of try to stop the dynamism of economies and the shift in economies across sectors. We can't hold that still. All we can do, I think, is make sure that our investment and our labour moves quickly enough to grab whatever opportunities are out there. And I prefer the governments didn't have their hands on those so-called opportunities.
But essentially, in a perfect world where we're all one big happy family and what part of one big market, shouldn't matter who produces fish hooks or shirts or shoes. But we're a nation, and you can't always assume forever and a day that you can import your toothbrushes from Malaysia and your God knows what, all the other essentials to daily life, your wine glass and your coffee from you have to have, in my view, at least some sort of base industrial capacity that can be always exists and supplies particular things and can be ramped up in the event that you need it if the geopolitical or other circumstances turn sour. But at the moment, that's we don't have that, and we're in a situation where we say we'll sell all this riches to China, and we'll rely, and we're not going to get involved in manufacturing much ourselves, and we'll basically outsource our security to the Americans. And to me, that's not like a posture of a self of what a nation should. It's a self-regarding nation should have much more control over both its economic and military.
Well, work it through. We wouldn't have enough money to do that. We've always been beholden to other big players, the British up until World War II, and even probably before that, that fell away. And we are beholden to the US. And if the US finds that it doesn't need us, we would be in trouble. It's not as if the Chinese, though, are going to walk in here ever. They don't need it, but they can knock us around and make sure that we sell to them things that they want at a price that they want. That can hurt us. But keep in mind that you don't have to go through the South China Sea to get to us either. I mean, there are other trade routes. It's just that they're more expensive. So I think we would survive even if China becomes more controlling and ebullient, in their immediate region. I'm quite confident of that. I don't think we have to throw in the towel a la Paul Keating on our US or AUKUS, or ANZAC alliances, but we do prefer to have the US in our pocket, or we be in their pocket, and we are ramping up our northern defence with US material. There's no doubt about that. There's probably a cost to that, but I don't think and that cost has been paid for every soldier that gave his life in various theatres of war, every Australian soldier. So we can't remake that. I'm quite happy that we're very close to the US. I'm confident that there would be other means by which and other routes by which we could continue to be supplied with toothbrushes and fish hooks and shirts and all the rest of it, but we cannot sensibly say, here are the list of things that will be made in Australia. It's just not possible, but we ought to keep as cheap as possible energy in this country, because it would provide a greater number of options for things we can do in this country. But of course, the upper middle classes are sold on the idea that the world is coming to an end because of greenhouse gas emissions, and that we have to deindustrialise on that basis alone. And that's what's destroying us, not the lack of tariff.
There are other topics I want to discuss, but the trade one's interesting because you're an economist. Like, you're clearly still an 80s liberal at heart. I gotcha. But it's not as though this Hawke, Keating, Howard era doesn't have sort of other similar periods of history. Like, the British in the late 19th century were engaging in unilateral free trade with Germany, right? You could import whatever you wanted, whatever manufactured goods you wanted from Dusseldorf to Britain, and Germany had its own tariff wall. It was very hard for British to, manufacture in Germany, but Thyssen Group and Siemens were opening up power plants and sending up. Britain was actually, I read a stat the other day which blew my mind. It said Britain, the home of the Industrial Revolution, was sort of at about 1900. It was exporting coal to Germany because Germany was using more coal, and most of it was one of its largest exports at that stage because it was deindustrializing. And so why, that didn't make sense in the long term because, Britain almost starved during the First World War because the German U-boats were able to potentially cut off. It didn't have an agricultural capacity to feed its population, and was certainly was missing out on, necessary supplies from elsewhere in the world was only because the Americans sort of were such a
Well,
large.
it had the Atlantic. It could look to the Atlantic and the US. So that there are other ways. It unfortunately had Ireland at its back, which we're not happy and interfered. But there were other means by which you could supply that country. There are many means by which we can supply Australia. So I'm not suggesting that we are living at a point in time. I'm sure Kamala Harris would have some sort of garbled notion of this of time, but we are living at a point where economics and strategic circumstances are such that we worry that we'll be cut off, but it doesn't undercut the sensible economics. That is, that we should do what we're best at and trade with others. But if there are bare minima, i.e. if there are a scenario whereby we were cut off until we could have other sources of supply, then that's a reasonable argument. But that might result in us saying, oh, okay, well, we'll need half a dozen submarines to take us out through, the Indian Ocean and somewhere else where we could get supplies. It doesn't mean to say that we have to do a great deal here, only that it would get us over the hump, even if that were a war. So no, I don't think we should say, here's Australia, we're a nation and we should do everything. No, never.
Okay, Gary Johns, very different to what's going on in the States, but no, I was curious about that. The other area, trade, immigration, foreign policy, the big ones which are being reassessed in the US compared to the sort of 80s consensus. Let's deal with immigration next, always a sensitive topic. Now, in the 80s, we've had, in a nutshell summary, Australia's been very effective at stopping illegal immigration, far more effective than the United States and Europe. But we have basically followed them when it comes to mass immigration. Australia has had very high numbers the last 2 years. But even prior to that, all the way back to the 80s, we have had significant numbers which have ramped up actually considerably during the Howard era as well, which people kind of tend to downplay. But, so what should be done with immigration? There's discussion which has come up from time to time. It was during the 80s when there was controversial, Jeffrey Blaney got into trouble for raising, at that stage, concerns about Asian immigration. John Howard got into trouble for saying the same things, which they still beat him up about. But that was more, and it was probably a tricky one, right? Because it always is difficult when you're trying to say a particular group shouldn't be allowed into Australia rather than focusing on the actual number. Because how do you design the test, if indeed you even wanted to go down that route? How do you design a particular test to see who's Asian or God knows what, right? So, what should the immigration levels be in Australia today? Should they continue to be 160, 200,000, or should they be, as Jacob Rees-Mogg recently argued after leaving government, in the UK, they should be in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands?
Yeah, well, we tend to have high immigration levels because it suits treasuries to have a lot of people coming in and eventually paying tax, and we don't have to look at per capita growth. We can just look at overall growth. So there's that faux war going on that our economics are strong. It's because we're just importing lots of people. Now, I think that the numbers of people who are coming in is an issue. Are we outpacing our ability to build houses for them and so on? But the other element, of course, is the values with which they bring. So there were very strong assumptions in the post-war immigration boom that people would assimilate, and they mainly came from Europe and very much from the UK. So that assumption was pretty easy. Yes, you'd come and you'd be an Aussie. And then we started to bring in people from different parts of the world. Why? Because it was easier to get here. The cost of travel was dropping. And then there was that sort of Bolshevik element that said, yeah, and we want to remain as Greek or Albanian or Lebanese or whatever. And that was okay. We went along with that. Now we've reached a point where every possible group now lives in Australia, and we worry if we're any longer a nation singing the same tune. So I'd start with the values question first, and then I'd go back to the numbers. If we were still bringing in people who we felt relaxed about their values, the numbers wouldn't matter so much. But if we allowed 1 million Gazans in a very short period, we would have a mini Gaza. We could be pretty confident of that. So the people you bring in matter. What do we do about that? Well, I think there is a solution. The Howard government, just as they were going out in 2007, created a values statement which a permanent resident would have to sign up to before they become a citizen. And that was the first time we started to, as a nation, say, yeah, you got to join the club. You've got to be an Aussie. You've got to talk about the liberty, free speech, equal rights for women, and so on. There's about a half a dozen things. But you just tick a box. It doesn't mean to say that you think in a particular way. And it's hard to say that we should make people think in a particular way. But we're now, of course, finding that we had basically a Judeo-Christian assumption. It wasn't just race and place, it was also the Judeo-Christian underpinnings and all of those stories that were told to us and we've learned in the Bible. So then come other religions, particularly Muslims, who say we place the laws, to some extent, place the laws of religion above those of the state. And we're quite the opposite. We say, no, you can have whatever religion you like, but the state always outbids religion. And we felt comfortable, a bit smug, because there weren't that many people of other faiths here who would begin to challenge that. Now we have very large numbers in southwest Sydney, and we have a Labor Party who've been recruiting like crazy among those people and are now caught. Right? They don't want to have a conversation about values. They will just call anyone who says we ought to filter immigration racist. And that's what we're hearing in the Parliament this very morning, I think, typically from someone from North Sydney. So I think we should apply something like the Howard Values Test offshore and earlier, meaning when a person applies for a visa, it's too late when they're here, got permanent visa, very difficult to remove someone. And this is what the Dutch are doing. So the Dutch have, since 2021, quite a firm examination of people who want to join Dutch society. And they're really saying to prospective immigrants, you have to integrate. You have to learn the language. You have to learn our ways. You have to look at the labour market. You have to look at the education system, and you have to pass. It's almost a certificate for. It's quite a course. Then you can come in. So I think we should do our filtering before rather than regret later. It would also slow immigration because it would mean that you'd have to have an Australian delegate offshore interviewing people who could then say, yes, I agree, you've passed the test, or no, I don't think you have been genuine, as well as ticking the boxes. I don't think that you would fit in. And okay, what does that mean? It means we would have lower immigration that would be less likely to be difficult to manage, in as much as we may have large groups of people who really are quite tribal and live differently. So there you go. I think we can have a conversation about that.
Yeah. Isn't there a sense, though, that the sheer numbers will overwhelm whatever type of neat value test policy that you want to try and implement? I mean, the example I always give is the nice, that ARC conference I attended in London last year, and they're all talking about, tell a better story, and we've got to like believe in the values of the West and all the rest of it. And yet down the road, literally, a couple of K down the road, you had 250,000. That was the estimate of the protest. Angry types, angry about Gaza and all the rest of it, chanting all sorts of stuff. And I just don't think that nice John Anderson rocking down there and telling them and having conversations and trying to convince them, or doing an assessment about their values is actually, or Jordan Peterson rocking down there, like I said the other night, and telling them to make their room. That's not going to solve the problem. It's beyond their capacity to change. And so,
well, I'm agreeing, but
hmm.
I'm agreeing. What I'm saying is, right now, we try to pacify those who are now permanent residents of Australia, who are out on the streets saying, wipe out Israel. We're spying on people. If we worry about them, we are spying on them. We are trying to open up the liberal conversation that John and others, and any of you and I would want to have with those who we worry about. But the third element I'm talking about is you don't get in if we worry about you. Now, that's what the Dutch and a lot of North European countries are starting to do. And unless we have that sort of test offshore, it's going to be more difficult to liberalise the internal, can I say, enemy. So, yeah, we do need another means by which we can settle us down.
So to test, just so I'm clear on the kind of what you're proposing, it would be like there effectively is no assumption that there should be an annual number of people that we let in. It's just if you can satisfy new stringent tests, then you stand a chance of getting in. Is that sort of what you're saying, or is that because at the moment,
yes,
it's hard.
Yes.
Yes, good.
But you can apply a number. You can apply a number as well. But I'm saying our test would be quite imposing if someone offshore wanted to take us to court, if you like. They'd have to apply to an Australian court. It'd be very expensive, very slow for them. At the moment, we've got 50,000 cases, I think, disputing residents in Australia stuck in the federal court. We'll never get through them. This is a very expensive process we have been landed with. So I'm saying take it offshore. It'll slow everything down. There'll be times, of course, when the cycles in the economy will say that we need more workers of a particular ilk. Sure, bring them in. The other discussion we might have, and I think we're going to, this has been happening for years, is that the Pacific Islands are under enormous stress from China. We worry that it's our back door, and we need to have significant movement by, the Fijians, Samoans, etc., in and out of Australia. Whether it's guest worker or what, and I know there are sensitivities about guest workers, but we need to win over substantially all of those Pacific nations, even as a bulwark against the Chinese. And that, I think, will affect our immigration stances as well. So that's another part of that discussion I haven't really thought through fully yet.
Yeah, no worries. I just think if you reduce the number, your old friend supply and demand, you increase the quality overall, because necessarily then you can pick and choose from the best rather than having such a large number. I'm actually a bit more interested also in the attitude in the ALP during the 80s, because we all hear about Jeffrey Blaney and John Howard getting beat up on, but it's almost like the Labor Party didn't have in the interest of workers' rights, was very much in favour of a restrictive immigration policy. I mean, they were as on board with, people argue the toss about which party was supposedly, less enlightened and more enlightened when it comes to immigration.
Again, there's a non-economic element to this. So there was the business of you'll lower the price of labour if you import too many. But there was the other game going on. Remember Andrew Theophanous in Melbourne, who was a federal Labor member, was sent off to jail because he was giving paid advice on immigration matters. Andrew was quite brilliant at stacking branches. So he was one of the early ethnic branch stackers. Now, that's rife in the ALP. It's probably there are elements of the Liberal Party too. So in the 80s under the Hawke government, there was a serious discussion and a serious push by the New South Wales right to allow an MP to import as many people as they wanted and almost control the process, i.e. they'd end up in branches. That was a disgrace. But Hawke appointed Senator Robert Ray as Immigration Minister from the right of Victoria, and he stopped that sort of nonsense. He realised that we needed a system of controls by public servants and strong rules. And we got that. And we should be very grateful for that, because there's always a Polly out there looking to play the game and import someone whom, you know, he could show grace and favour to. They would look favourably upon his party and vote. I'm still thinking New South Wales right. Yeah. I'm grateful that we have a reasonably objective set of rules. I think we should intensify those and take them and apply them offshore, and that'll give us much better control over immigration. And remember, ultimately, it's the Australian electorate who have to give permission to levels of immigration. It's just that the two main parties have basically been in cahoots for years to keep the numbers high for economic reasons, for boasting reasons.
Yeah, and because they've been, you know, it's been political. There's been political danger in even talking about that in anything other than a rose-coloured kind of way, right? And I think people are very sensitive about their precarious position, and so have decided to just not engage in that conversation in any sort of meaningful way, too, with exceptions, right? But not from the mainstream parties.
Yeah. Well,
can we
throw in just to tail off this discussion. Had Boris Johnson, Boris won Brexit, and then he won an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons. And then he didn't deliver on Brexit. One of the big elements for Brexit for those Northerners was immigration. Right, there are lots of other elements in it, getting out from under outrageous European trading rules and courts and all the rest of it. But basically, and COVID probably got in his way, and he got sick, and he basically lost his mind, frankly, and went crazy on net zero. But had he delivered stronger immigration rules, he may have held a large number of those red seats in the north, and Britain would be different today. But he didn't. He failed. He didn't deliver, and now they've thrown back into the Labor mire, and they have no solution.
Yeah, he like Matt Goodwin, who's a political scientist in the UK and quite a well-known one, he makes the point that Boris didn't understand why his mandate simply didn't understand.
That's right.
The other final one, again, foreign policy. We have had, and it wasn't the Hawke government, but sort of post Cold War, we have had now 30 whatever years of interventions, right? You know, of American-led interventions in Serbia, Libya, Syria, Iraq. You know, you name it. There's been a lot of them. Afghanistan, obviously. None of them you could say unequivocally have been a rip-roaring success, right? And what do you think? I mean, what is the explanation for that? We've got Ukraine now too, and I know many people are very as passionate about that as people were about, you know, Iraq at the time, and how do you decide how should Australia determine what type of these future interventions it gets so emotionally invested in future? I mean, what's the criteria that we should use?
I think we found post 9/11, the idea was that one, America was hurt and they wanted to crash and burn the Middle East, but they covered it in a sense with where they were going to export democracy, and we find that you can't do it. If a nation is still a nation of tribes, in fact, they're barely a nation, Afghanistan, if they're tribal, then if you want to export democracy from the west to the east, let's say, you'd have to stay there 100 years. It's a bit like when the British and other European nations walked into the New World or into Africa, The longer they stayed, the greater the chance was that those colonial societies succeeded when the West left. So if you're going to go in, you have to stay for a very long time. The answer for the West now is don't do it. Leave them to their own devices. Now, the alternative to that is, how come Japan is a democracy today? Because they weren't, we had to invade, well, we bombed them and then walked in and took over Japan, and they've been successful, so has South Korea. So there are instances where you might be able to pacify and democratize, but they are very few and far between. We should be very cautious about that. And just to finish off, I suppose, with the Ukraine, I would draw a line under Ukraine. That is something that's gone on for 400 years maybe, and I think NATO has to say, we'll come up to the new line, and the Russians can hold whatever they've taken. There's not a lot left of it there anyway. We'll do a swap between people who want to live in Russia and those who want to live in Ukraine. And for Putin, NATO is now right at your door.
Okay.
That's what you didn't want. You've now got it.
Final question.
Anyway, that's just a thought.
Yeah, no problem. They're tough issues. The final question. The Washington Consensus. I'm sure you've heard the term, right? It was the policy framework in trade and finance which dominated since at least the end of the Cold War, well before it. What should the new and that has changed. That there was previous Washington Consensus that existed 2015 is a very different consensus, bipartisan consensus that exists today. Trade, immigration, and well, not so much immigration, but certainly on trade, and it'll change on immigration and foreign policy too. What should the new Australian consensus look like compared to what it existed in the Hawke, Keating, Howard sort of era? What should change?
I like the Trump view here. Is that if you want a liberal international system, then America can't keep paying for all of it. I mean, America runs the UN. They house it and they pay for half the bills. And you remember at some stage, I think in George Bush Jr.'s period, they were going to pull the money out of the UN. I like the idea that Europe should pay for its own defence. I have no idea what the Americans are there 70 years on from World War II. Well, we know sort of in a way. But if the Europeans can't pay for their own defence against Russia, then there's something seriously wrong there. So I do like the idea that the Yanks are saying, look, we were the world's policemen. We'd sort of like to be the world's policemen anymore, but we can't afford it. So we're going to have to not cut and run. We're going to have to better define those areas that we'll work at. We hope they work hard in the Pacific, and they should let go of Europe somewhat. And then if Europe can't defend itself, well, all is lost. I mean, if Western Europe can't defend itself, then the Yanks aren't going to help them out this time. I mean, it's just, they don't have enough money to do it. Their ratio of debt to GDP is huge. So there's less trust that they can do it.
Everywhere has problems, but the Europeans I am very bearish on overall. But Gary, thanks very much. If people want to find out more about your current projects, which actually involve not always anything we discussed today, or find out more about stuff you've written and the like, where should they go? How should they seek you out?
closethegapresearch.org.au. I do focus most of my time on the Indigenous question. And we'll continue to do much of my work in that area. But thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Well, thanks for your time, Gary. I'll see you around as I always do, and appreciate you making time to thrash things out today. Thanks very much.
Terrific. Thank you. Great. That's nearly 1 hour, mate.